Today, as part of the World Airmail Day celebration, we are privileged to present six distinguished speakers and 5 hours of enriching Aero and Astrophilatelic talks. Our speakers today will take us through a fascinating journey. Each session promises deep insight, historical perspective, and engaging philatelic scholarship. Let us now begin with our first speaker. Mr. Max Smith will present on Indian Airmail at the time of Pearl Harbor, 1941. Mr. Smith has been studying the postal history of India for over 40 years. He has authored and co-authored two books and written more than 100 articles on various aspects of the subject, including airmail. He also served for many years as the editor of India Post and is the former president of the Society of Postal Historians. Mr. Smith, over to you.
Good morning and good afternoon. Well, thank you for the invitation to present this subject. I don't consider myself an aerophilatelist, I'm a postal historian, but airmail falls squarely within the subject. And of course, airmail, when it meets events, is indeed postal history all the time. So I feel justified in presenting to you today. This is an important subject, little researched, and I'm only aware of one article that deals with it in any detail, which was my own article in India Post 15 years ago. And very little, I'm afraid, has advanced since then. Anyway, straight into the meat of the matter. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 was one of the most significant events of the Second World War, when the Japanese Air Force attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor early on the morning of 7th of December 1941. This brought the USA into the war. I'm not going to enter any of the military or political questions of the time, but it brought a very sudden end to the Pan American Clipper airmail flights across the Pacific Ocean. For 18 months, this had provided the only civilian all-airmail route between India and Europe. No aircraft were lost or attacked at that point, but it meant that the Indian airmail could be stranded across 3 different routes, unable, to complete their journeys eastwards. Just to set this in geographical perspective, you can see the critical importance of Pearl Harbor at Hawaii, but the map itself is not sufficiently illustrative of what I want to show, so I'll move quickly on to consider what actually did happen to the airmail when Pearl Harbor was attacked. The accepted theory is that the Trans-Pacific Airmail was stopped and returned westwards along the Horseshoe route to South Africa, and from there by sea via the UK, which was undoubtedly true for most of the mail, but there are some exceptions, and I'm going to show some of these here. There are also many unanswered questions. For example, we do not know how long any particular mail was in censorship during transit, and indications are that this could be several days. We don't know which flights carried a particular letter from India, and we don't know whether there was sufficient capacity on board the aircraft. And most importantly, we don't know when the mail was delivered, because neither the UK nor the USA routinely stamped mail on arrival. So it's often not possible to prove what happened to a particular cover. I mentioned the horseshoe route, and this is an Air Ministry illustration of its full extent. You can see it takes the shape of a horseshoe running between Durban in South Africa, through Cairo and Egypt, across India, down Southeast Asia, past Singapore, to Australia. And it took that shape in November 1941 because in Europe, the Mediterranean Sea had been closed to airmail since June 1940. Britain and Free France were at war with Germany and Italy. So the westward airmail from India to Europe and the USA had already been diverted via South Africa on the horseshoe route. It took 8 to 10 weeks to get to GB, and often it was no better than the ordinary sea mail. However, for urgent airmail, American flights across the Pacific were available, which reduced the flying time to about 3 weeks, but cost at least 3 times the normal air fee. The air fees themselves were an addition to ordinary postage, and the basic rates are set out there on the right of the screen. They had been unified from May 1941. Before that, they'd been very complex. But the standardized rate to the USA was 2 rupees 12 annas air fee plus the postage, and the air fees to the UK were 3 rupees 4 annas plus the postage. And the illustration is the wonderful the Boeing B314 clipper that was used for flying across the Pacific. Now, in diagrammatic form, the difference between the routes available, and there were a couple of variations, are shown here. And I've taken these maps from Geoffrey Brown's very good studies of the subject generally a few years ago. So the first alternative was through Hong Kong via Chongqing in China, which was expensive. It involved many changes of aircraft and had actually, I believe, fallen into disuse from the Indian point of view, certainly from August 1941, but probably from May as well. Its variation was to continue mail on the horseshoe route down to Singapore and meet the American flights from there, which unfortunately the Indian Post Office never seemed to announce to the public. I suppose in wartime everything has to be secure and clouded in some form of secrecy, but it meant that the public were probably as confused as anyone else as to how their letter was going to be carried. You see an awful lot of superscriptions on mail from this period where, in fact, it's impossible to say whether anybody had real notification about which was the next flight. Now, the flights that I've just mentioned here from via Chongqing and Singapore were weekly alternatives to the American FAM 19 route via Manila and Hong Kong. The alternative route was to join the American FAM-14 route at Auckland in New Zealand. This took longer. It was a longer distance, and it was also a fortnightly route, every 2 weeks, that is. So it was quite a complex arrangement in the first place to conduct airmail in these circumstances. I've summarized the connections that were possible in this table, which I don't expect everybody to remember now. But on the left, on the green headings, those are the Indian departure airports. And on the right, in the brown, are the American flight contact points and departure points. The important flights to remember are the last flights from Singapore, here, which I'm circling, and from Auckland in the orange, both at the end of November, because otherwise then they weren't even scheduled to arrive in America before the date of Pearl Harbor. But in practice, mail posted at any of these points within the period from early to mid-November is liable to have missed the last flight. And I can demonstrate this from some examples. The critical point are, for these covers and the way that I've arranged the slides, is by chronological order, taking the date into consideration. So a cover from Bombay, or via the Bombay censor, it's from South India, Tremulgeri, on the 10th of November, arrived sometime in Great Britain, but there's no possibility of identifying exactly when because there are no dates available at all. But a cover from the same date via Calcutta, also directed via Auckland, was noted on arrival the 10th of February 1942, which is a journey time of 3 months, and there's absolutely no doubt that that was via the Horseshoe route and returned westwards. So it was too late, even by that stage, for the last flight from Auckland. 2 days later, on the 12th of November, this postcard from Darjeeling via Calcutta, directed via Auckland to the USA, is a bit of a puzzle. If it had been in time for the last flight from Auckland on the 25th, then it would have arrived in the USA in December. But there are filing notes on the postcard, and since there are 2 of them, then I suppose they must be more credible than just perhaps one that's written incorrectly. But both of them are dated in January 1942. On the front it says January the 5th, 42 as a receipt date, and on the back January the 15th as the reply date. Now I have to give some credibility to the fact that that might have happened, because it is now known that there was an American ship, the Mariposa, that crossed the Pacific from Sydney on the 17th of December to San Francisco. Not only the flights were paralyzed at the point of Pearl Harbor, but also the sea mail was too. So there was an awful lot of mail aggregated and stockpiled at the terminus of the Horseshoe route at Sydney, and I think also again at Auckland in New Zealand. But there's no official documentation about what they did with any particular mails. So this is evidence that it could have suggested that postcard was on the Mariposa across the Pacific by sea. But going back to November, 2 days later after that postcard, there is still registered mail that's probably too late for flights via Singapore that were returned on the Horseshoe route. And the following day, on the 15th, there's a cover via the Calcutta Centre that provides the only real evidence that I have at this point of a cover being on the last successful flight from Singapore. Since it was registered, it had to be handed over and signed for by the receiving postal authority, the Americans, and they did this fairly consistently well. So registered mail at this point is very useful. And it's stamped in San Francisco on December the 6th, which is well in time before the attack the following day. The next event that I want to draw attention to or skip on to is dispatch on the 20th of November from Karachi. As normal, there's no date of arrival, but the unusual feature is the new sensor label examined by 1681. This is a United States label, and sensors number 1461 to 1740 were all stationed at San Francisco. So this is late November, too late for the flights, but somehow it's arrived to be censored at San Francisco, which suggests that it crossed the Pacific by some means. On the 22nd of November, another cover via the Calcutta Censor also has a sensor label from San Francisco. And again, there is no date of arrival, and the United States censors didn't use any dates, any identifying stamps that might have been an additional clue to revealing when these events took place. Another cover posted on the following day, on the 23rd of November, is extremely useful because it's addressed to the USA, censored at San Francisco, and it's been redirected on the 9th of February from Massachusetts to New York. So that implies that it's been in the USA for a couple of days already. So there's a bunch of mail already showing that there was at least one batch of mail that was sent across the Pacific by sea. Well, by sea, it would have to be by sea to get there in terms of early February, having been closed from early December. This is supported again by a cover posted the day following on 24th of November to Chicago, and very kindly they've stamped the letter on receipt, which is most unusual. But not all mail was sent across the sea, even in those circumstances. One from Bombay on the 24th of November, a heavier weight letter, which I've given the postage information for in terms of the calculation. Asks an awful lot of questions that I'm afraid I can't answer at the moment. There's no date of arrival, so I can't be specific, but I presume that it was returned on the horseshoe route. Even though its contemporaries seem to have crossed the Pacific by sea, this hasn't been censored, and this is unusual. There's a declaration there that is written in the Iranian language, and I would have thought that by whichever route it had been sent to the USA, that should have attracted the interest of an American censor, but apparently not. So I'm afraid that leaves a whole lot of open questions. Moving through November again, by the 26th of November, I think it's it's absolutely impossible for a mail to have been in Singapore in time for the last flight. The question is simply, what happened to it? Mail to GB from the northwest, Peshawar, was unmarked and obviously was returned by the horseshoe route in the normal way. This is proved by a cover on the 29th of November, when by chance this is slightly deficient, and which is unusual in wartime, and certainly charging postage due on a very small deficiency is extremely unusual. In fact, 3 pi deficiency is so small that it falls beneath the minimum amount that can be converted in international gold centimes. So it has to be charged just the 5-cent gold centime calculator, which was converted in Great Britain to 1 halfpenny postage due, which must have cost more than that to collect, let alone to account for and stamp at the same time. And the date, of course, there is 28th of January, which is consistent with 8-week normal route westwards on the horseshoe. Mail from late November is quite plentiful, and it's all unmarked and must have been sent back on the horseshoe route without any problem. The filing notes on this material can be very helpful. This is 30th of November from Balaram in the Madras area. The filing note says written November the 11th, which is obviously a mistake, but received January the 27th, and it's been calculated to 6 weeks, 4 days. That's absolute clear evidence of the horseshoe route. But as we move into December, mails were still being posted, of course, because Pearl Harbor hadn't occurred, and the instructions to divert mail hadn't even been set up. This is to the USA, directed via Chongqing. And this has the San Francisco censor label again, like the batch from at least a week before. There would have been different dispatches from India, of course, different flights, and the last one on which mail was actually carried outside India, outside Penang, seems to be this NE143 from Calcutta on the 7th of December. And that mail was transferred backwards on the horseshoe route. If this cover had been on that flight, then it wouldn't have arrived in San Francisco. So it shows that there's a very slow throughput onto the available flights, even by that date. And the following day, has a wonderful cover, the 4th of December from Karachi. And the curious thing is, it's been stamped at Calcutta on the 6th of December, the day before Pearl Harbor. It's registered, and it had been stamped at San Francisco on the 2nd of February, 1942, which means that it crossed the Pacific, but not obviously by air. The other curious feature is that hasn't been censored by the Americans either. Perhaps they forgave censorship at the time because they stamped it suspected liable to a customs charge, and perhaps the customs function, fulfilled a censorship purpose as well. But nevertheless, more questions again than answers, and proof yet again that early in December, mail was still escaping from India without being turned back on the horseshoe route. Another cover the following day, censored in San Francisco. Rather a shame that there's a 2 rupee stamp missing there, but nevertheless, these are quite rare. I mean, I have to put in quite a lot of covers simply for evidence. On the 6th of December, there's more covers with San Francisco censors. So clearly this was a fairly large batch that was going to both the USA and Great Britain, because on the 9th of December, there are covers to GB, and that were still being dispatched eastwards, even though the instructions were to return everything westwards by the horseshoe route. And the last one that I have was dated the 10th of December, although there is a later example in India Post dated 12th of December. So this is actually now after the event had taken place. And still, mail is trickling through and being carried across the Pacific by sea. The question that remains to be answered, of course, is which ships carried it and where was the mail accumulated from. It was probably not from Singapore, I feel. I think it was likely to be Sydney in Australia rather than Auckland in New Zealand. But nevertheless, it's interesting in so much as you can never make a sweeping statement about what happened to any particular mail. Now, just to complete this, because we always have to consider postal history in both directions, I'll just briefly touch on some mail coming westwards from the American side. From Canada, in mid-November, this cover was in time for the last flight from San Francisco on the 19th of November, reaching Singapore on the 29th. Incidentally, that was the date that same China Clipper aircraft turned round and performed the last successful flight eastwards. India very helpfully stamped mail on receipt, and there's a Bombay date stamp of 6th December as evidence. Another cover dated the 3rd of December from Canada met a rather more unfortunate fate. It was carried on the last flight from San Francisco to Hawaii and was in Honolulu by the 6th of December when Pearl Harbor was attacked the next day. All the mail that was in Hawaii at that time was detained and held by the Information Control Branch before being censored and released then onwards. Now, I noticed that I put down under the words on the right-hand side that it was returned by the horseshoe route. That's not necessarily definite, because by the time this mail would have been released from Hawaii, no doubt in late March, then a fresh airmail route had been opened up eastwards across the Atlantic and via Lagos and West Africa. And I suspect that might well have been on that route, because it did perform that journey by air, as evidenced by the Karachi airmail cancelled stamp. The mail from Great Britain seems to have mystified everybody. It had a more complex journey to perform to get from Great Britain to America to be able to get onto the American services. And unbeknown to most people, including the authorities, there were serious backlogs even in Great Britain before mail was being dispatched to Lisbon, where again mail was being accumulated again. So these three covers, all posted at the end of November 1941, had left Great Britain and crossed the Atlantic by sea before Pearl Harbor. Sorry, no, they hadn't. They hadn't left America by that time. And they were all delivered eventually in India in the same week, between the 30th of January and the 6th of February 1942, entering India from the east, because they've been censored at Calcutta. So quite where they were is a real puzzle. But the most graphic illustration of delay, I think, is this cover from Great Britain, posted on the 10th of October. It wasn't delivered in Calcutta until the 22nd of January, which is a total of 3.5 months. So at each stage and each handover, clearly there were abnormal delays. This just shows the depth that airmail study can lead you into, and should do. You can't expect to find all the answers, and I'm pleased to say that I don't expect to find them too. All I can do, I hope, is point out the way forward for other people to pursue and follow afterwards. And I'll just finish with one cover from the USA to India, paid for and directed by the Trans-Pacific Airmail route, 90 cents. Posted on the 3rd of December, which was a week before Pearl Harbor. but it was diverted not westwards but eastwards to be on the first FAM 22 flight from New York and Miami across the Atlantic to Lagos, Leopoldville, West Africa, and was then date stamped and censored in Cairo at late December, 20th of December, which was a wonderfully quick service, arriving in Bombay on the 15th of January. It shows that you can't really take anything at face value, and the authorities were hard put to maintain whatever services they could, and I think did a marvellous job in those circumstances. So if you're puzzled, it shows also that I'm puzzled. I've been studying this subject on and off now for over 15 years, and I have only found one or two concrete pieces of information, and most of those have actually come from the covers themselves. So I commend this study to further research, and I won't read the summary out in any detail, but I give there the latest dates from India that would be in time for the last flights, and the first dates of batches that were known to have been received and censored in America, in San Francisco. And they'd seem to fall into two groups. The mails in the third week of November and the first week of December seem to have been dispatched separately, but arrived across the Pacific around about the same time in early February, which is evidence that they were all accumulated at a single point and crossed the Pacific all by sea at once. The real mystery, of course, is the one that cover the postcard on the 12th of November that seems to have arrived in the USA in January, that could have been on the ship, the Mariposa, which set off from Sydney in middle of December. But that's the only piece of evidence I've seen from that voyage, certainly to India I'm talking about. And if anybody can find any more, then please display it and show it, because it will be a great rarity. So with that, I'll just draw it to an end, and I thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Smith.